This is Optimal Finance Daily, episode 2030. How 5 Daily Habits Rocked My Financial World and Turned Things Around by Jillian Beirne Davi with JackieBeck.com. And I'm your host and personal finance enthusiast, Diana Merriam. Now let's get right to it and continue optimizing your life. How 5 Daily Habits Rocked My Financial World and Turned Things Around by Jillian Beirne Davi with JackieBeck.com. 6 years ago, I was broke. I was deeply in debt to the tune of $30,000, and creditors called me nonstop. I felt powerless, hopeless, and totally alone. It was one of the darkest times in my life. The worst part was, I thought I was making good money. I was just clueless about how to manage it. I decided to take my power back and get into action. Looking back now, I know that taking action is the best way to cure anxiety. When you're taking action towards your goal, you feel powerful. When you're hiding under the covers, anxiety will crawl into bed with you. Eventually, every debt was repaid, and I went from being an impulsive spender to a devoted saver in about 18 months, without credit consolidation, bankruptcy, or counseling, and I've never looked back. Sharing my story. I shared my story with a friend who was struggling with similar issues. Curious, she asked me how I did it. The truth is, I never really thought about how I did it. Without really looking closely, I just figured I got sick of being broke one day and got into action. But when I retraced my steps, I found that my success ultimately boiled down to a handful of daily habits that turned my finances around. And anyone can repeat them. The hardest part is remembering to do them consistently. So here are the 5 habits I adopted that got me on the road to financial recovery for good. Number 1, I committed to using all cash every day for a year. Me and plastic? We had to break up for a while. I decided that debt equaled slavery, and my first order of business was to cut the cards and use all cash instead. I closed many of my store accounts and held on to my oldest card. I kept that account open but did not charge any new purchases on that card. Note, I used my debit card as a substitute for cash when a card was needed. At first, I was scared to go all cash, and it felt like my very survival was at stake. But eventually, I learned how to live within my paychecks. It got easier over time, especially since I also adopted the next habit. Number 2, I checked my balances online every single day. For a long time, I never shared this with anyone because I thought it seemed obsessive. But for some kooky reason, this habit worked. Checking my statements every morning kept me honest about where my money was going, and it made it less likely to spend impulsively throughout the day. I had a real dollar amount rolling around in my head, not some fuzzy estimate that made it difficult to make good decisions. Number 3, I kept a crisp $100 bill in my wallet as a symbol of my financial future. Okay, this one probably sounds a little nuts, but it worked like gangbusters. See, when I was paying down debt, oftentimes I felt poor. To feel better, I kept this bill as a reminder that in my financial future, my wallet would always be full. Anytime I made a purchase, I was reminded of my goal. It helped to keep my motivation high when funds were low. And no, I didn't spend it. I held on to that same bill for almost 3 years. Number 4, I put 1%, yes, just 1% of each paycheck away into a savings account automatically. In the beginning, my savings account was teeny tiny, but it wasn't about the dollar amount at first. It was about getting into the habit of saving regularly. As I began paying down debt and closing accounts, I would take money that was being used to pay down debt and instead put it towards my savings. Eventually, the power of momentum took over, and I started to save more aggressively over time. Once I completely paid down my debt, I started putting all the money that was going towards credit card payments into savings. And number 5, I rewarded myself on payday. Anytime I stuck to my budget for an entire pay period, I treated myself on payday with an affordable luxury, something I really wanted that was pretty low cost. I would treat myself to a nice lunch, a manicure, a brand new book, a 10-minute massage, or a bar of expensive chocolate to show myself a little love and appreciation. Over time, I really came to look forward to those little treats, especially in those last few days before payday when my bank account got low. I knew there was a reward at the end, so I was able to stick to my plan without dipping into my savings. These are the 5 habits that I used on a consistent basis to help turn my finances around for good. The best part is, after 6 months of sticking to these habits, they became automatic. I no longer had to will myself to do these things. They came naturally. Now it feels weird when I'm not in harmony with my finances. It's become second nature. I have these powerful habits to thank for my success. Your turn. Now it's your turn. What about you? What are some powerful money habits you could adopt that would make dramatic changes over time in your financial life? The beauty is that once they become routine, you've got a strong foundation to make lasting change with your money for good. You just listened to the post titled, How 5 Daily Habits Rocked My Financial World and Turned Things Around by Jillian Beirne Davi with JackieBeck.com. I loved how Jillian described how she changed her mindset around money in this article. She reminds me of my own journey in that I had more of a money management versus an income problem. Many people put debt in the category of death and taxes. They believe it's just a necessary part of life. But this isn't true. It's totally possible and definitely preferable to be debt-free, especially if it's high-interest credit card debt. So I think the first part of digging out of debt is simply believing that you can live a full and happy life without it. When I think about my mentality when I was charging up my credit card and digging a debt hole in my 20s, I recall this belief that I would be able to pay this off easily in the future when I was making more money. And then I made more money and it had no effect on my debt. I think many of us have the erroneous belief that more income will solve our money management issues. But we don't magically become financially savvy just because we have more money. Take lottery winners, for example. Whether they win 500 million or 1 million, about 70% of lottery winners will be back to the same financial position they were in before they won in 5 years or less. This is a pretty compelling statistic that demonstrates that money management trumps income. Another thing I noticed about accumulating credit card debt is that more often than not, I had the cash to pay for things, but I hated seeing the balance in my bank account decrease. So I put purchases on a credit card and paid the minimum. I didn't understand that compound interest was working against me, and what seemed like a manageable amount of debt in the beginning was going to explode into a pile of debt that would stress me out. So when you're considering buying something using credit, it would be helpful to remember that if you can't afford that thing with the cash you have now, you definitely won't be able to afford the compound interest that will accumulate later. And that should do it for today. Have a happy rest of your day, and I'll see you on the Thursday show tomorrow, where your optimal life awaits.